Welcome, everybody. This is Mike Consol with writing coach Dr. Julie Miller. We're going to talk about formatting this week, the importance of formatting. It can make copy so much more visually friendly for people. It can enhance the reading experience. It can take away some of the difficulties of reading. Some people have difficulty reading just in terms of the effort that's required. So anything that we can do in the way of formatting that makes that simpler, both for us as writers and for our readers, is a plus. And Julie, I know you recently wrote about one of the elements of formatting. You wrote about, in your newsletter, about subheads.
Right, exactly. Michael, generally what we have seen, and I think you just touched on it very nicely, is that people are becoming more visual readers. Just for example, I have clients who write proposals. Well, in the good old days, you just wrote text. Now, even in very professional engineering proposals, people want pictures and they want formatting. So they have, as you said, ease of reading to be able to get through even dense and heavy and technical text. And subheads can play a role in that. And one of the things we know is that there is something to be said for consistency with your subheads, with your headers actually, and your subheads. And I often advise people that you ought to think about how you will title your headers and your subheads for consistency. For example, are you going to have your titles be all benefits? Or is the title a summation of what is in this section? So that's one of the things I recommend for people.
Well, and when you talk about density, I've seen papers where you look at it and it looks like a solid block. There's not enough paragraphs in there. There's no texture. There's no white space. And it intimidates people right from the start. You look at it and you're already tired because you know it's going to be a slog.
Yes, exactly.
Or at least it looks like it's going to be. I mean, maybe it reads easily and beautifully, but you don't, they say in the restaurant business, my brother's in the restaurant business, my uncle was in the restaurant business, they say the eyes eat first. And when you look at your plate, if you don't see something appetizing, the restaurateur is off to a bad start. It means that the diner is already expecting to take food into his or her mouth that is not going to be particularly pleasing. Obviously, the eyes eat first with reading as well, but it starts with the formatting. It starts with that visual impact or lack of impact that we make because we don't pay any attention to the formatting. And I will say that when you talk about subheads, one of the ways I use subheads, because I use them quite regularly, especially in the cover profiles I write, when I do interviews with those cover subjects, the conversation is wide-ranging. Mm-hmm. And it means that there's transitions in the copy. And obviously, as we become better writers, we learn how to make those transitions. But oftentimes, the easiest thing to do is rather than to try to bend the language and make a transition that might be difficult to make, a subhead signals to the reader a complete change of subject, that we're going in a different direction at this point, or there's going to be a shifting of gears. And that has always made the actual writing of the profiles easier. And I think it also makes the reading easier because it cues the reader that, hey, we're changing directions here. And that helps the reader track. And tracking is critical to comprehension. And basically, once we confuse the reader, we lose the reader. So you want to make sure there's continuity and comprehension there. So subheads can play a really important role, as you know, Julie. And
yes.
And also just when we write a document, make sure that there's texture there. Make sure that there is some white space. Do not write gigantic paragraphs. There's rules around paragraphs, but what we don't want to do is write gigantic ones so it looks like a solid block, a monolith of copy that, again, would intimidate a potential reader.
Exactly. And, one of the other things for readability is to not do a justified left and right, a block style, that now you're seeing more and more documents with a ragged right. because it is easier to read than a right and left justified. You get weird long words just to make it get to the border on the right. So the whole idea of ragged right is really important. And I think the other thing is that if you do bullets within these subheaders, that you remember that the rule of parallel structure. So if you start each bullet with a verb, you have to do it all the way through. If you start with a noun, all the way through, all of your bullets have that structure. And again, only 7 bullets, no more than that. I've seen documents from technical people where the entire page, Michael, he started with bullets, then he went for the clear bullet, then he went for the dash, then he went for the diamond, and he finally went to the asterisk. The entire page was bulleted items.
It's terrible. It's supposed to create ease of reading, and instead that makes it all the more difficult. That's another act of intimidation.
Yes. I love your idea, your analogy of the eyes. Say it again. I think it was
the eyes eat first.
Yeah, that's fabulous. That's fabulous. And I think the other thing you can do in your subheads is to make them engaging. Think about what would be clever that would draw the eye and the interest of the reader to that particular paragraph or two. Something clever as your subheads works as well.
That's a really good point. And if you read good magazines and newspapers, you'll see that they use good wordplay on their subheads to the main headline. They'll have a main headline. Sometimes they'll use a hammerhead that's clever. Sometimes they use the subhead to introduce some language that's clever. The Economist magazine is a good example. The Wall Street Journal is a good example. Mm-hmm. And there's many good examples. Also, I would Vanity Fair magazine and so on. It just makes it that much more interesting. And a lot of times what's best is not to be so literal. When you're trying to make your subheads more interesting, oftentimes you're not being literal. You're not being literal, but you're playing off of the subject matter, and the reader understands it. If they don't understand it going in, they understand it when they after the subhead. And one of the examples I like is the Wall Street Journal. The A heads they do in the center of the cover of the newspaper, they'll say something. It'll talk about a merger, it'll talk about something in the second deck, and they'll do this third deck where they would say something like a lost copper penny. And it's like, what does that mean? Mm-hmm. Well, we don't know what it means, but it's intriguing. Or it says, a half-eaten egg salad sandwich. And it's like, what's that about? And they basically put what one writing coach at the Poynter Institute called a gold coin. It was basically enticing the reader to read into the story to find out what that is a reference to. Of course, the Wall Street Journal is beautifully written, and you really don't have to go very far to get a reward. It's right off the top. The Wall Street Journal is a spectacularly written newspaper. Exactly. It's almost like a writing coach in itself to read good writing, and I think that's good writing.
I tell people, if you want to be a better writer, read the Wall Street Journal. As you say, the writing is brilliant. Even on the most dull topics, they do a beautiful job. One other thing I want to come back to, Michael, when you're talking about white space, really white space is a writer's friend, and especially when you're writing on the screen, that people can only take in so much before their eyes tire on the screen. And sometimes it takes a little longer to read on the screen than it does with a hard copy, piece of paper.
Mm-hmm.
So
and I absolutely, and I want to also circle back to the ragged right. What a lot of people don't realize, and you mentioned this, but I want to talk a little bit about the technical aspect. If you're not using ragged right copy, if the copy is what they call justified, the spacing between the letters, which Julie was talking about, Some lines are stretched out, some are more condensed. And when the eye has to go back and forth, when there's not a consistency, which you do get consistent spacing between each letter with ragged right type, it makes it easier to read, as Julie said, and it also automatically really adds not context, but it adds texture to the page.
Yes.
It adds some white space. Also, don't be afraid if you're using a Word document. Go ahead and indent the page. You don't have to go border to border. You can create white space. If you look at some good reports or white papers, oftentimes what they do is they indent. They've got that white space, oftentimes, whether it's on the right or the left, and then they'll utilize that white space by maybe doing what is called a pull quote, where they take something, a particular line or quote from the document, and they pull it out so that it's another way to entice the reader, another point of entry into the copy. So something to keep in mind. There's so many. This is what, before we started recording, I was saying to Julie, there's so many aspects to formatting. So we're only going to skim the surface right now, but one else I want to throw out there, Julie, and maybe you'll comment on, is also picking the right font or the right type style.
Yes, I'm so glad you're bringing that up. Yes, let's talk about that, Michael. What are you saying people should use for font?
Well, I mean, I think there's a couple different factors to take into account. To begin with, there's only so many fonts out there that are really made to be used as body copy for a document. Some of the famous ones are Georgia, or I'm trying to think, is it New York? What's the Times Roman is a very popular one, although it's kind of old fashioned. If you're doing a technical document, if it's about technology, sometimes people use a sans serif typeface like Calibri. Or Arial,
or Verdana.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, the research I've heard, though, is that when it comes to body text, it's really probably a good idea to use a serif typeface. And, because we don't have visuals here, I would just say that if you look at Georgia or you look at Cambria or you look at Times Roman, they have the little accents on the end of each of the letters or most of the letters. And it's more your traditional typeface, and its research has indicated that that's easier to read than sans serif, which looks more like a computerized font.
Right. Well, I guess my last point I will make, and you and I talk about it all the time, it's all about the reader, whether it's subheads, font, formatting, it's all about the reader.
Yeah, and I will say also, when I was starting off about the subheads, that's an example where it makes it easier for the writer as well, but ultimately we do ourselves no good writing something that in some way is impenetrable, whether it's visually or it's the actual text itself. We've got to always keep the focus on the reader because, for obvious reasons, that's simply the way it is. You can liken it to playing music. If people are not going to be fans of your music, nobody's going to show up to see a play or nobody's going to buy your recordings. It's the same with writing. It's got to have musicality. It's got to have appeal. You've got to have people saying, I want to read this. Or this is imparting good information and is doing it in a very silky fashion. So that's a little bit about formatting. There's so much more to it, but we'll leave that to another day, another time. We will be back next month with a new topic. Until then, thank you for listening, and good luck with all of your writing assignments.
Yes.